Natural law and how it worked in society was at the very heart of Enlightenment thought. The idea that the betterment of the human condition was inevitable provoked a diverse but passionate array of responses. Of course, when it comes to perhaps this idea of progress, there would be some who would be against this idea of this kind of linear progress from one age to another. Of course, others, such as Marx, suggested that there was sort of a movement towards a more utopic society, and progressivists in general have asserted that society over time has become increasingly better. March of progress sociologists, for example, have posited that the rights and the entitlements of certain marginalized groups such as women and children have gotten better over time. Aries, for example, noted on an anthropological basis that children were generally treated with more neglect in the medieval Middle Ages, yet over time entering into the modern age, they were treated as a vulnerable group with certain rights and privileges. In the same vein, Young and Wilmore argued that relationships between men and women had become more equal, and that for example, men were taking up more domestic labor and women were entering the workforce more. There are, of course, those who are opposed to these changes. Some may view Western notions of progress as in reality regress. Those who are more religious minded may view the increasing liberties of our society as regressions to a more animalistic or carnal society which emphasizes animalistic desires over spiritual sort of connection with God and spiritual purity and piety. The reality is more complicated in that even though, whilst human development has exponentially grown and developments and breakthrough in knowledge and technology have grown over the centuries, it's not a simple linear progress. There's ups and downs, and there is always the possibility or the chance that we may end up regressing. And there have been cases in human history where there have been periods of regression and stagnation. And if we were to also take perhaps the most subjective or relativist view, for what may be viewed as progress for one society may be viewed as regress for another society. Another interesting point perhaps to posit here is that if you were to take the view that time is cyclical and that societies go through a cyclical cycle of sort of rise, fall, and decline, then the reality is that many of these ideas or many of these new notions may just be old repackaged ideas, or they may simply be reintroducing old concepts and old phenomena back into contemporary society, which of course would have been forgotten in the collective conscience or the collective memory of the people. There's a very interesting notion that many sociologists currently have, which is they trace this kind of linear progress of humanity and of Western civilization in specific terms from the Protestant Reformation and the breakaway from the Catholic Church all the way up to the Industrial Revolution and up until the current day. Even though there is some precedent to this argument in that one event is linked to another event and that each of these events have caused other events within the great timeline of Western civilization, the reality is that to suggest this kind of similarity between the Protestant Reformation and, let's say, the Enlightenment is slightly absurd, and it doesn't take into account the more complicated and nuanced nature of these developments. Followers of different religions adjusted the concept of natural law to suit their particular beliefs, giving emphasis to some values while diminishing the importance of others. Protestant philosophers tended to promote the idea that doing good for others mattered above all else, while Catholics stressed the importance of personal piety, insisting that individuals needed the guidance of the Church on specific moral issues. Hobbes' deceive published in 1642, directly challenged the Protestant ideal, insisting that man could only be a sociable creature when forced to do so by a sovereign power. For Hobbes, man's natural state was one of uncontrollable passions, utterly unsuited to sociable living, and an autocratic leader was needed to keep civilization in check. This would essentially be the more authoritarian argument, which is that the natural world or an unorganized society would be one of chaos and turmoil and disorder, and authority and order and law are required to keep people in check and to keep society functional. And of course, there are issues with this, and this can very easily lead to tyranny and the micromanagement of people's lives. But the great authoritarian insight is that all things naturally tend towards entropy, or they tend towards disorder. And in order to counter this natural tendency to disorder, we must have a strong sort of structure and a rigid sort of rigidity to our structure of society via the maintaining of law and order through a centralized authority. In counter and opposition to that, the great libertarian insight is that people need general freedom in their own personal lives, first of all to achieve fulfillment and happiness, but second of all, if the government forces them to take on certain roles, they will not actually be the most efficient version of themselves, and thus this will actually harm society in the long run, as overall output of desirable products and sort of desirable work and results will be limited. For Hobbes, man's natural state was one of uncontrollable passions, utterly unsuited to sociable living, and an autocratic leader was needed to keep civilization in check. A number of thinkers responded to Hobbes' description of man's natural state as a reign of passions by looking at sociability as something that was solved over time. It's interesting to note here that this kind of draws on certain biblical teachings of humanity possessing this animalistic aspect to them. The Islamic tradition shares something similar in that man has both an animalistic side to him and a angelic side to him. This animalistic side of his tends towards carnal desires and lusts, whilst this angelic aspect of his tends towards higher spirituality and sort of higher principles. And the Islamic insight in this regard is that whilst we should strive for the hereafter and for spiritual fulfillment, man must also not forget his animalistic side, as that will lead to resentment and a lack of fulfillment in this world. And so the Quran has advised man to not forget his portion of this world either. Hence, man must fulfill his obligations in this world and he must take care of himself, but in the long term strive towards the hereafter and towards spiritual success, which is considered the true success in the Quran. Interestingly, Christians obviously had a very similar concept. However, Christians tended slightly more towards the monastic tradition in the more classical sense. Of course, in sort of modernity and post the Protestant Reformation, the West became quite materialistic. However, Christianity initially was quite a monastic tradition. Nevertheless, if you were to view man as a chaotic entity which naturally tends towards animalistic desires, versus viewing man as more of an angelic entity which tended towards higher spiritual fulfillment and truths, then this would quite obviously influence your worldview as to whether or how much authority was required or not. There's a very interesting debate regarding the nature of man and if he needed authority or not. German philosopher Samuel Pufendorf suggested that man was not innately sociable but had become so over time. Way before the institution of the state, men and women had come together and had begun to live under the shaped values of the law of nature thanks to reason and reason alone.